Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India, and we are at Bank of Baroda Mughal tent. We are delighted to introduce Panopticon, the age of surveillance. This is the digital age, and the condition of modern governance relies on the covert power of observation. Best-selling author and politician Shashi Tharoor is chairman of the Parliamentary Panel on Information Technology and raised attention to the alleged illegal surveillance of journalists and political leaders via Pegasus software. Retired Judge Madan Lokur writes extensively on legal and justice systems, human rights, politics, and individual and national sovereignty. Investigative journalist Swati Chaturvedi has previously covered political organization in social media and was among the list of individuals whose communication were intercepted with spyware. In conversation with Mohit Satyanand, experts on political organization and intelligence discuss this unprecedented era of Panopticon. Shashi Tharoor, a third-term member of parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, is the best-selling author of 23 books, both fiction and non-fiction. Madan Lokur served as a judge at the Supreme Court of India from 2012 to 2018 and is presently a judge in the Supreme Court of Fiji. He is the only Indian to be appointed a judge of the Supreme Court of another country. Swati Chaturvedi is an Indian print and broadcast journalist, reporter, columnist, and panelist for various newspapers and channels like NDTV, Gulf News. She has authored 2 books, Daddy's Girl and I Am a Troll, Inside the BJP's Secret Digital Army. Mohit Satyanand is an entrepreneur and investor and has been instrumental in establishing businesses that produce packaged food, promote the arts, and teach languages. He is currently the chairperson of Teamwork Arts and also serves on the board of several other companies, both public and private. Shashi and Swati are going to be signing their books after the session, so get your copies. This session is sponsored by Value First.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be on this panel with the all-time JLF favorite, Shashi Tharoor.
Oh, thank you.
There you go. With Justice Madan Lokur, who's been called the polymath judge of India. With Swati Chaturvedi, who produced this very insightful and insider view of I Am a Troll about the BJP's social activities. So the Panopticon, what is the Panopticon? The Panopticon was this sort of construct of a circular multi-tiered jail with all the cells arranged around a central well, and the jailers could sit in the middle and see from one spot what was happening in every cell. It was never built in real life, but the digital age has made it possible for people sitting in one place to survey what's happening, not just in their own jail or their own nation, but literally across the world. And a few years ago, there was a book which took the intellectual world by storm, which was called Surveillance Capitalism by a New York intellectual, Zoshana, I forget the name. And but we've moved on from there. And today, I think a bigger concern, at least in India, is the surveillance of the state. I might dare to call it surveillance fascism. I'm, of course, inspired by Shashi's ability to coin new phrases. So surveillance fascism. So I'm going to ask each of you to answer this question. Are we there yet? And if you had to compare the dangers of surveillance capitalism with surveillance fascism, which scares you more? Let me start with Swati, who's closest to me.
Well, I think we're definitely there. In fact, I think all of us have heard about Pegasus, the spyware, which is like a weapon of war, which was used against me and a lot of other journalists, about 10 other journalists in India. And it is a gross invasion of privacy because I don't think I'm anti-national. I'm just a journalist who does my job. And for the government to, it costs 30 crores per person that they use this software on. And it is a gross invasion of privacy. It monitors you 24/7. And it was done to me for 2 years, and I still don't know why, because our government has not given us any answers.
Madan.
Yeah, thank you, Mohit. I think it's not that we are there now. I think we were there much earlier. In 2012, Indian Express had raised a question under the Right to Information Act. And the response that they got was that every month, they are intercepting between 7,500 and 9,000 phone calls, right? Which means something like 200 or 250 per day. Okay, that's in 2012. In 2016, the minister had answered a question in Parliament in which he said that it's 5,000 interceptions per month, okay, which comes to, I think, about 150, 175. So, and now, recently, in 2019, a question was asked by some NGO saying that, how many interceptions are there in a month? And they said that there's an exemption under Section 8 of the Right to Information Act. So we can't answer that question. So I think we were there in 2012, if not earlier.
Well, I don't like to fling about words like fascism too easily because they become a term of abuse rather than a useful term of analysis. But the surveillance state certainly has been growing, and it's surveillance statism, if you like, because in many ways it's the stranglehold of the bureaucracy on the appurtenances of surveillance that is the problem. I've seen a figure of 1 lakh of interceptions a year, Madan, but we're all in the same ballpark. And the strange thing in our country is that when these rules were written, you have interception, and we we have a robust review mechanism, but the people who decide the intervention, unlike in many democracies where the judiciary has to approve it, the judiciary has no role. Interception is authorized by a committee of secretaries, usually the Home Secretary, the Law Secretary, and so on. And the review committee to which it must go by law, this is touted as the big fail-safe mechanism. The review committee is also a bunch of secretaries, a cabinet secretary at the head of them. So essentially what you've got is a bunch of government bureaucrats deciding for themselves. And I have spoken to some of them after their retirement, and they've all admitted there is absolutely not even the most cursory review possible. When you have to prove 100,000 names and often a long list of numbers, as one cabinet secretary said to me, there are more important things to do. So I just sign off. He says, I've got to trust my colleagues. But that's precisely what's wrong with the surveillance system. And that's only telephone interceptions we're talking about. When you look at data interceptions, there you have a much more serious problem. I actually, well before this whole thing started, I introduced a private member's bill in Parliament that would create a data protection law and at the same time establish a data protection authority. And what's interesting is that when the government came up with its law, it has a similar regulatory body envisaged. It may even have the same name, but it's exactly the opposite of what I intended. It is once again a body of government bureaucrats appointed by the government, accountable to themselves. Now, the entire point of having a regulatory authority is that it's got to be independent. You have judges on it, you have journalists on it, you have citizens who are the common users of data, and let them opine when an application is justified or not, but not in the eyes of our government. And I have on various occasions raised the same concerns about lots of government initiatives. During COVID, we had the Arogya Setu app, which briefly was compulsory, and they fortunately heeded our objections and took it off the compulsory list. But the Arogya Setu app was meant to trace your contacts, to warn you when you were in proximity to a COVID-infected person. But obviously the same technology on your phone can also tell them when you're meeting an opposition leader, attending an opposition rally, etc., etc. It's a terribly intrusive and dangerous form of surveillance. I discovered that the Delhi police had arrested over 118 people during the CAA protests on the basis of facial recognition software that no one has ever authorized by any legislation. We have the DNA Protection Bill, which entitles the government to essentially build up a massive nationwide data bank of all of our DNAs, again, without any data protection built in. So example after example like this raises very serious questions about whether indeed a surveillance state is emerging.
Swati has something to say, I think.
I just want to say that, what you said about the committee is correct, but Pegasus is only sold to the governments across the world by Israel. And the list of people who were being spied on by Pegasus went to know the Committee of Secretaries, went to know Secretary. In fact, it is completely illegal. It is completely unauthorized. And all that the government has said in Parliament is that, yes, we used it. Now, why are you using it against journalists?
They haven't said that, Swati.
They haven't said that.
Ravi Shankar Prasad said that we use all these things.
Well, he never said explicitly.
But he says we use all
and
these
his successor
things.
has denied it explicitly on the floor of the House.
Therefore, they can't, if they've denied its existence, there can't be a list of those who approved it, right?
Exactly. There's no committee. It's totally illegal and unauthorized.
Right. Well, that's presuming, we're presuming that it existed. We're presuming that the Indian government paid for it, all of which presumptions I agree with, but it's not been stated on the floor of the House now.
Nor has it been proven in a court of law.
Exactly. So we'll come to that, but I want to push back just a little bit and ask, every government gathers data, whether it's as basic as census data or epidemiological data or whatever. At what point in time does data gathering become surveillance? Could you perhaps talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you see, the whole purpose of the data collection or data gathering, that is what is important. So, like Shashi said about facial recognition, all right? Now, you can have, CCTV cameras over here. Why are you having them over here? There has to be a reason for it. The reason that is sometimes given in Delhi, for example, they have a very large number of CCTV cameras all over the place. They say it is for the protection of citizens. All right. Now, once in a while, maybe once in a month or maybe twice in a month or something, some crime takes place and the CCTV camera catches that picture. And that is used as a justification. See, we had that CCTV camera, we had that facial recognition technology, and therefore we were able to catch hold of the person. So really, therefore, there is, a question of the intention behind it. Now, if you are using, if you're tapping phones, interceptions, 150 per day, without any application of mind, because I'm sure this cabinet secretary and all these secretaries, they don't have time to make 150 signatures, and find out why are they making these signatures. The intention obviously is to gather data about those people. And that's when it becomes surveillance, that you're gathering data because you want to gather data, not because you have some, good intention in mind. That's what is troublesome. So when you're talking about DNA, when you're talking about, phone interceptions, when you're talking about facial recognition, the intention becomes important. And then the second stage is, what are you going to do with that data? So if you've got information about a person speaking to the opposition or going to attend an opposition rally or going to a protest or something, okay, I know where you were, right? I know what you did yesterday in the afternoon. That becomes dangerous.
So the question then becomes, this often difficult to define boundary between big brother and caring brother. And that's where you come to the institutional mechanisms which need to be in place to prevent misuse. So would either Shashi or Madan like to expand a little bit on that?
Well, I mean, there are, it's not so much caring as protection, the protective brother, because the big brother here has been given specific grounds on the basis of which this surveillance can be done. And they include, national security, public order, the imminent commission of a crime, friendly relations with foreign countries, which is an awful catch-all, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the grounds on which they're allowed to authorize. They all involve protecting the state. That's what the the exceptions are for. The problem is, and I think Madan will confirm this, is that nowhere in any legislation or jurisprudence are these terms actually defined in a very precise way. So national security from the point of view of these government bureaucrats is what they say it is. They even tried on the Pegasus issue that Swati mentioned to say to the Supreme Court, we will not be filing a deposition because this affects national security. And fortunately, the court had the gumption to say, we're not going to give you a free pass every time you mention national security, you better file something. So there was at least some pushback, and let's hope it continues. But the fact is that this is the kind of challenge we have. If you can justify pretty much anything on the basis of these terms, and you can, then you essentially have an unrestricted license to tap anyone in this country. Tap, intercept, capture their data, eavesdrop on their phones, whatever, and say it was justified under this provision. Now, worse still, of course, is the fact that once you've done all of this, what you do with it is not governed by any of the laws. When Swati mentioned that these committees didn't meet on Pegasus, these committees were set up under the Telegraph Act of 1885, the IT Act of 2000. 2000 is way before, half the companies encroaching on our data existed. And the IT rules of 2000 and whatever it was, 5 or 9, which sort of tried to regulate how exactly these things would apply. But the fact is that there are a lot of things are happening that go way beyond, for example, the words of the law like interception. If you can actually put a malware on somebody's phone and be able to clone their entire phone sitting in Israel or wherever while this chap is using his phone in Chhattisgarh, I mean, is that something that is defined under the provisions of the law? What about the specific prohibitions that the law has written? So a lot of updating, a lot of clarification is required. Will the government bite the bullet on it? I don't know. But I can tell you that in the government's data protection bill, what they're going to do is, in all the drafts we have seen, they have written themselves an exception. That is that all the protections in the law apply in principle to anybody who wants to intercept your data, except the government can give itself a free pass. And rather large numbers of people in the government have the authority to give themselves a free pass if they want to intercept your data.
Which of course raises the question, Madan, which is where can an ideal Supreme Court step in to prevent this kind of what I would call malafide legislation?
Yeah. Okay, I just want to correct Shashi. The government did not file an affidavit.
Oh, it didn't.
It didn't.
But it filed something that they're busy studying right now.
Yeah, they said something, and then the Supreme Court appointed a committee, but the affidavit was not filed. That's where the problem is. Okay, this is one case where the government said we're not filing an affidavit. There was another case in the Delhi High Court where the court said that please produce the records, so that we can see what was the decision and why was it taken. And the government said, no, we're not producing the records. You do whatever you want to do. So really, I think at the end of the day, the Supreme Court has to be tough. And if the government does not, obey the orders of the court, then draw an adverse inference. We've asked you to file an affidavit. You're not filing an affidavit. All right, then we will assume that what the other side has said is correct. We've asked you to show us the records. You don't want to show us the records. Fine, we'll assume what the other side has said is correct. So really, it's for the courts to stand up and say that, listen, when you're talking about civil rights, when you're talking about personal liberty and so on, you better obey the law. You better obey what the Constitution requires you to do.
So let's take that a little bit further.
Yeah.
Let's assume that a court actually stands up and says that, and the government still refuses to. What is the remedy?
No, there is no remedy. Many years ago, Alexander Hamilton had said in the Federalist Papers that the judiciary does not have the power of the purse or the power of the sword. So really, if the government says we're doing nothing about it, all that the court can say is that, well, we haul you up for contempt. But then to haul up the person for contempt, there has to be somebody to arrest that person. Exactly. Okay, and that person is somebody from the executive. And if the executive says, I'm not going to arrest that person, what are you going to do about it?
Can I ask a question? What about the sealed envelope that the Supreme Court has encouraged very recently in a lot of cases?
Yeah.
That, everything in the sealed envelope is fine. People don't need to know.
Yeah.
All
yeah.
you need is a sealed envelope.
Yeah. That according to me is a disaster. It should not. It should definitely be discouraged, and the court should not accept it at all. I have no doubt about it.
In fact, we're slightly off topic, but we've just had a case in Kerala where a channel was not, its license was not renewed after 10 years. And they said, well, what have we done? We've never been guilty of any violation of anything. And the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting said, we are helpless. It is a Home Ministry requirement. So they went to court. And the Home Ministry duly provided its evidence in sealed covers. So the judge said, fine, national security, channel will stay off the air. I mean, there's something extraordinary about this. If national security in a state which is not officially at war at any rate, can actually override every one of the basic democratic protections our system has.
Yeah, can I just explain that a little bit?
Please, Madan.
Yeah, you see, the law is under the Evidence Act that if something has to be kept away from a litigant, then the secretary in the ministry or the head of department has to file an affidavit saying that I have seen the record and in my view, it pertains to the affairs of the state, and therefore the material should not be disclosed. All right. Then the court will see that affidavit, the court will see the record, and it may agree or it may disagree with the secretary and say that if it, well, we don't think it pertains to the affairs of the state, and therefore the material can be disclosed. This came up quite some time back in 79 or so, when there was a problem about the appointment of judges. And the secretary in the Ministry of Law filed an affidavit saying that this pertains to the affairs of state. The Supreme Court had to look at the record, they had to look at the affidavit, and they said, no, we don't think it concerns the affairs of the state. And therefore they disclosed the material. Now, what is happening with this sealed cover, which you had mentioned, Swati, is that somebody takes a decision. Who that person is who takes a decision, nobody knows. And that person says, I'm going to put it in a sealed cover and give it to the Supreme Court. Whereas it is the obligation of the secretary in the department or the head of the department or the ministry to file an affidavit. It's not that some guy can just get up and say that, listen, I think this is, something pertaining to national security or something, and therefore I'm putting it in a sealed cover. No, that's not his job. It's the job.
Mother, what's worse is that the accused is not shown the sealed cover.
That's even worse.
And the accused therefore cannot defend themselves.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Other countries have national security dilemmas too. And the British national security practice is when there is an exemption sought for national security, it has to be attested by a minister of the crown.
Yeah.
And the evidence in the sealed cover is shared with the accused, who can then defend himself in a tribunal by challenging that evidence.
Yeah.
Right now, you can have anything said.
But would you say, Madan, that the ultimate onus, given the fact that there's a willing nexus, if you would, between the executive and the party and power, would you say that the ultimate nexus then must be with the court?
Well, I wouldn't say it's, the nexus is with the court.
No. That the ultimate onus should be on the court.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's for the court to decide whether it's a matter pertaining to the affairs of the state,
right,
or say external affairs or something. But, coming back to what Shashi said about an accused, it can never be pertaining to affairs of the state. Here is a media house whose license is either going to be cancelled or not going to be renewed. Or you have cases, pertaining to the Delhi riots, where a person is going to go to jail. It's not a matter pertaining to affairs of the state.
So what we are seeing that the court is not exercising its role, its mandated role in terms of defending democracy.
Yes,
that's what we're seeing, right? It's not
you
willing
could
to
say
push
that.
back.
Yeah. Well, you could say that, the provision of law that is there under the Evidence Act is not being followed, and that is unfortunate.
I could extend that to a different domain, which is the court's refusal to entertain matters which are intrinsic to democracy. It's the same thing. It's an abrogation of responsibility. You can talk about electoral bonds, for example, or you can talk about Kashmir. So what I am seeing as a layperson, as a concerned democratic citizen, is the Supreme Court abrogating its duties.
Yeah, well, abrogating its duties is a little strong, but yes, it has to prioritize the work.
Right.
Okay, so Kashmir is something which is important. Electoral bonds, very important.
Right.
Kashmir, of course, is also very important. But you can't say that, I'll deal with the electoral bonds after 5 years.
That's what's
What sense does
happening.
it make? Because in those 5 years, there'll be about 10 or 15 elections.
Exactly.
So you have to decide it quickly.
Right. So as a check to the executive, it's not working, right?
Yeah,
In critical matters. So use whatever word you want. I'm not. But there is some kind of abandonment of a sense of priority in what is important to the state.
Yeah.
So I want to come to another check, which is within the parliament, and I'm going to come to Pegasus. And Shashi chairs a committee on information, and there was to be a sitting in regard to Pegasus. And from what I heard, Shashi, in your conversation in which you outed the dark name of our friend Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, I'll call him by his full name, that we had the most extraordinary circumstance where 3 of the secretaries who were summoned by the parliamentary committee, which you headed, didn't show up.
Yeah, it was quite extraordinary in that they'd all been convened 2 weeks earlier. And between an hour before the meeting and 15 minutes before the meeting, each of them sent very sort of similarly worded fax messages regretting their inability to attend because of pressing commitments. Now, there is a procedure whereby a senior government official, for good reason, can seek to be excused, but the chairman has to excuse them and decide whether an alternative person may replace them. I had not done so. I had not excused them, and I had insisted they come, given that they had been confirmed this should be on their program for the last 2 weeks. When they nonetheless didn't show up, I did protest to the speaker, who assured me that first, that he would summon them and read them the riot act, and secondly, that he had done so. In practice, of course, that absolutely changes nothing. But for good measure, the committee has, at least in theory, 31 members. I say in theory because I've never seen all 31 in the room. The highest we've ever had, I think, is 21 or 22 for a similarly controversial issue. Otherwise, the average regular attendance is very much in the low 2 digits. And that's usually the case in many committees. The ones who really care about the issue, done their homework, they're the ones who come and participate. In this case, 17 people showed up. And because all parliamentary committees reflect the political balance in the House, a majority that came, a good majority, but 10 of them were BJP members. And the quorum for the committee is 10. So the 10 members were present and refused to sign the attendance register. So that just in case I was able to strong arm the secretaries into coming, they would then say there is no quorum and the discussion couldn't take place. So it was a double whammy, as you can imagine. I checked whether, because in the House itself, a speaker can establish the presence of a quorum by counting heads. I said, I can count heads, can't I? But the secretariat told me I could not, that in committees, only a signature on the attendance register counts as presence. So they were there, they were quite disruptive. They were trying to shout down the opposition MPs who wanted the meeting to proceed, because we said if the secretaries don't come, we'll still discuss the issue. But they did not allow that particular event to take place. And so it was very clear that the oversight mechanisms, and some of you may be aware that even before this unsavory episode, when Pegasus first erupted in the media, and I was asked by the press, I immediately said that though I'm the chairman of the committee, and ideally the democracy parliamentary oversight should get to the bottom of this, knowing the system as well as I do, I would urge that this matter be taken to the judiciary. I would urge victims of this software to go to the courts, because they're likely to get more redress. And I gave an example. The court would have a power, for example, to summon a recalcitrant government official. which the extent of my powers are feeble. The court could, for example, ask for an infected phone and send it off for forensic analysis, which I can't do, my committee can't do, and so on. So if you really want a serious inquiry, the courts are the best.
So Shashi, that raises several issues. The first is, just as the courts are, in a sense, to an extent, not willing to do their duty, now you have a different situation where another check and balance, which is a parliamentary committees, are not being allowed to do their duty. We'll come to what happened in terms of the Pegasus going to a court of law and commission of inquiry and so on. But since we're talking specifically now about Pegasus, can you tell us briefly, Swati, about how you realized that your phone was infected, and some thoughts about why you?
Well, why? Because I'm a journalist, and that is not a good thing to be in New India. I mean, there are journalists who are in jail for doing a story they haven't done. They're thinking of doing a story, so the government jails them. This happened in UP. We also have comedians going to jail for a joke they didn't tell. So I think the joke is really at this point on us. I found out about Pegasus because one of my sources met me in a place, told me to keep my phone away, and then told me that, this is what is going on and you should be very careful, because this is malware to the extent where 24/7, your camera is a weapon which they can see you, what you say, where you are, what you're doing from the bedroom to the bathroom, everywhere. It is horrendous invasion of privacy. But, I found out because Forbidden Stories was working on a story on Pegasus, and they took my phone, they got in touch saying, you're on this list, and they put it through a forensic audit where they saw that, my phone had this malware on it. And interestingly, in Pegasus, the US says that Pegasus cannot be used on any US citizen. So, we as Indians need to know that why is our government, a government we elected as citizens, using Pegasus on opposition politicians, journalists, and basically anybody they think is, not on board with New India.
So, Swati, invasion of privacy is obviously not something that I would like to condone. But the question, I'm sure that's not what they intend, right? There must be a purpose. What do you think that purpose is?
Obviously, to find out what a journalist who they think is inconvenient, which is not, my journalism has not changed in 20 years. I'm doing exactly what I've always done. But this government in particular does not like journalists. They like what I call panna pramukhs, who cheerlead them on. So any kind of journalism, they think that real journalism is injurious to their health, which is why you have these joke television channels who compete every day in telling you how wonderful and brilliant, and as a Supreme Court judge called him, what a versatile genius our Prime Minister is.
Not me.
No, definitely not Madan. Don't look at Madan. In one session yesterday, Pavan Verma said something, which is that one of the worst things that you can have is a human being or a body which think that they have the monopoly over the truth. And I was thinking about this last night in the context of Pegasus. I was thinking of two people I know whose phones were probably infected. One is Paranjoy and the other is Sushant Singh. And I was thinking, Sushant Singh is breaking one truth repeatedly, which is that all is well at our border. And that becomes an incentive to scare him, to find things that they can use against him. And Paranjoy is telling the inconvenient truth that this is not a government that is pro-markets, it's pro-businessman, and it's pro a particular kind of businessman investigating the Ambanis and the Adanis. And so there's a specific reason to tackle specific journalists, which is why I was asking you, Swati, why you think that this is being used against you in particular. Was it because I'm a troll?
I'm a troll. It happened certainly after I'm a troll, but since this government's come in, I've done a lot of stories in The Wire, in NDTV, which they really clearly didn't like. And the reason any government wants to keep tabs on a journalist is to know their sources, to terrify the journalist, to terrify the sources, and say, look, we know you're leaking to her, and we're going to get you into trouble. So for me, my sources are sacred. And this attack on anyone who's willing to speak to a journalist, I would go to jail for my sources, So for them to do this is to just terrify people and not speaking to me. And when they don't speak to me, I don't speak the inconvenient truth.
I'm glad you don't see this as fascism yet, Shashi. I see very strong streaks of it there. Madan, I want to ask you, I know that certain matters are sub judice and you wouldn't like to talk about them, but I find it very interesting. Firstly, that the West Bengal government should decide to take up the Pegasus issue when it's clearly a national issue. So can you and perhaps Shashi also speak to what that meant?
Well, really, I can't speak for the West Bengal government. All that I can say is that I was approached by the government to head a commission of inquiry. And they told me what the terms of reference of that commission of inquiry would be. And so I said yes, but whether there was any politics behind it or there was no politics behind it, I have absolutely no idea. So we, after the notification came, we, got down to business because we had to draft the rules of procedure and so on and so forth. And then, at some point of time, the Pegasus issue reached the Supreme Court. A submission was made on behalf of the West Bengal government, because one of the submissions that was made to the Supreme Court was that the notification setting up the Commission of Inquiry is unconstitutional. The West Bengal government does not have the power to issue that notification. So on behalf of the West Bengal government, Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi said that, all right, we will request the commission not to proceed with the inquiry. So we did not proceed with the inquiry because the Supreme Court had said that, listen, we are looking into the matter, so why should a commission of inquiry look into it also? So we respected what Dr. Singhvi said in the light of what the Supreme Court had said. And later on, the Supreme Court, disposed of an application for interim relief. And they did not mention anything about the Commission of Inquiry. So we discussed the matter, and we assumed that because the Supreme Court has not given any stay, it had not given a stay even earlier. It had not given any stay, nor did it say anything about the Commission of Inquiry. We thought that, we could go ahead with the inquiry because it's time bound, and there was no stay. So we proceeded to record evidence, including that of Paranjoy, as you mentioned. And then it was brought to the notice of the Supreme Court that, well, the commission is going ahead with its task. So then the Supreme Court gave a stay. That was, I think, around 6th or 7th of December, something like that. So since then, we haven't done any work on
And
that.
so as far as Pegasus is concerned and the affected journalists and others, kindly wait, you are in the queue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court did appoint a committee of a retired judge, Justice Ravindran, who has given an interim report. The committee was supposed to give it within 8 weeks. The order passed by the Supreme Court was, I think, around 28th of October. And they were supposed to give it within 8 weeks, which meant by the end of December. And maybe I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, they gave some kind of an interim report, but no final report has been given. Now, what are the contents of that interim report? We don't know, because that's in a sealed cover.
So we have about 9 minutes left, and I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. But before I do, I want each of you to say a few words on the fact that it seems that parliamentary committees are not being allowed to do their job. The Supreme Court, whatever gentle words you want to do, is quite complicit in letting things slide. So what is the nature of recourse for a democracy and a people who do not want to be surveilled? Shashi.
Well, I wouldn't say parliamentary committees are not being allowed to do their job, but in this particular instance, clearly not. In fact, Pegasus first surfaced as an issue in 2019 when the Toronto Citizens Lab contacted a number of Indian activists, particularly those active in the tribal belt in central India, to tell them their phones have been infected through a loophole in WhatsApp. A call to WhatsApp, you click on it, it comes through. So the activists wrote to me, and I invited them. And we went through another extraordinary event. We had a lot of unprecedented developments in this committee, but where the BJP majority sought to prevent discussion. by using a provision that had not been resorted to ever before, of actually calling a vote on the subject. Fortunately, two people can read the rules. So I discovered that if I could manage a tie in the vote, I have a second and casting vote as chairman. And so I was able to persuade a couple of BJP allied parties who have subsequently been moved off the committee that a discussion was a good thing, and they voted for a discussion. There was a logjam, and I then proceeded to cast my vote. But the discussion, in fact, gave the affected activists an opportunity to air their grievances and concerns. But we got no joy out of the officials, who essentially have been taking the
So back to the question.
that they have no information. So, I mean, the committee can do its work, but there are various methods by which the effectiveness of that work can be constrained. Now, on the question of whether the courts can help, I still think we have not fully exploited the potential of the court to get involved in some of these matters. In other democracies, courts have actually issued rulings about what national security means and where personal liberty begins. And certainly, I'm sure that in a good court action, citing what has been said by judges in the US and the UK and elsewhere is admissible in our courts, and I think can lead to an interesting, it would put our judiciary on a spot of deciding otherwise, especially after the Puttaswamy judgment, where so if there are some very clear yardsticks that will be required to be met before privacy is breached, then many of these issues can probably be brought before the court. So I'm sorry to say this as an elected MP, that I too place more faith in the potential involvement of the judiciary in resolving this than I would in parliamentary institutions. And don't forget, the big flaw in the parliamentary system, which I've been excoriating for 25 years, is that the executive is the legislature too. That you elect the legislature to form the executive. Once the legislature has got a majority that is owned by the executive, it no longer functions.
And the whip.
Yeah, absolutely.
Madan?
Yeah, well.
So he's placing the faith in the court, and you?
Yeah, I do place the faith in the court, but I believe that the court should be more proactive, right? And it should stand up. Okay.
Which it's not, which is why the question.
Yeah. So therefore, the court has to be more proactive, and it must stand up. It's not standing up enough, if I may put it like that. But it should stand up.
Swati?
Yeah.
Support really noisy journalists, and here all of us here, I think we
right on. Support noisy journalists. Yeah.
We already know that we are being surveilled. How many of you use WhatsApp for all your business or other calls? I mean, yeah, so all of us know, we know the truth. We should actually, as citizens in a democracy, hold our government accountable that, they have no business, surveilling, doing invasive surveillance of Indians who may have a different view. We all have a right to our views. We are a democracy and we need to fight for it.
Back to my point, monopoly over the truth. Questions, please. Okay, the first one, this young man here in orange, and then the young lady.
While the mic's going to both, it's also worth saying that if the government didn't do the Pegasus surveillance, some foreign country, some foreign government has put Pegasus viruses onto Indian phones, and that's an even more serious.
That's much more. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I have two questions. First one to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. It emanates from a recent Caravan magazine article on how Truecaller's success, just 30 seconds, I'll be done. How Truecaller's success banks on India's inadequate data privacy laws. So I want to ask the chairperson of the Committee on Communication and IT, do you think that Truecaller is an unethical app on accounts of my data privacy and digital consent? And the final question to Justice Lokur, do you think that data privacy jurisdiction is something to be considered very universal, or it should owe to financial and geopolitical differences between countries?
So as chairman of the IT committee, I can't give you a conclusion. The article has landed in my inbox yesterday, and I've been busy at the festival, but I do intend to read it and as appropriate raise it in the committee. We need to find out how this is working and what protections there are. But equally important is the data protection law, which the government has still not fully brought before the two houses. When it was brought for consideration, they deliberately didn't bring it to the committee I chair. They instead set up a JPC chaired by a BJP member to vet it. I mean, all of which are entirely sort of doable under our system, which is again the flaw we have between Parliament and the executive being indistinguishable. So we'll see. But I mean, I have, as you probably know, a particular BJP member has frequently called for me to be removed because I express views on matters that are properly before the committee. I don't believe I sacrifice my rights to express those views, but on this matter, we will see how the committee takes a position on it. It's certainly a very important question. You're right to flag it.
Madan, national jurisdiction versus universal.
Yeah, I would go for universal jurisdiction, but I think we need to also define what is privacy. That's not yet been defined, but I would certainly go in for universal jurisdiction.
Young lady, yeah. Well, we just have 2 minutes.
Greetings to the panel. My question is not directed to anybody in general. It's just that as the youth of today, I just want to ask, what can we expect in the near future? On one hand, we are being taught that we have the freedom to express, we have the right of freedom, we have the right to privacy. And on the other hand, we are being surveyed or being told stories about surveillance. So what can we expect? Would our right just exist on papers in the near future?
Let's start with Swati.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right. The court also makes a lot of pronouncements, but they don't reflect in orders. So, we all make very pious statements saying for freedom of expression, FOA is sacrosanct, all of that. But actually, when you actually start fighting it in court or somewhere else, you really don't get the support you deserve.
Shashi?
No, I think you've got to fight for your rights. I think these are your rights. They exist in the Constitution. They've been upheld in various judicial pronouncements. I think you've got to stand up and say, no, I will not be intimidated into surrendering my rights to an intrusive bureaucratic surveillance machinery. And I think that we can do this. My great faith and hope in Indian democracy is that we can make it better, just as some in the government are trying to make it worse. If we stand up for our rights, we will be able to defend them. And for God's sake, the privacy judgment is just a few years old. Didn't exist before. That's a massive expansion of our rights as individual citizens. There will be more, but keep fighting.
Madan, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I think I would go along with Shashi and say that we have to fight for our rights. We have things like, internet shutdowns, for example. Now,
the most in the world.
Yeah, the most in the world. But then, just look at
by
what's
far
happening.
we're more than most other countries put together.
Nevertheless,
But
even
look at
after
it-
dividing.
Look at it from the point of view of what's happening in Ukraine, right? You can see the Prime Minister speaking every day. There's no internet shutdown over there, and there's a war going on. So why should we have internet shutdowns over here? That's one small thing.
Absolutely. The gentleman in the dark blue shirt, can we?
We said this in a report of the committee to Parliament. It has been royally ignored, including by the media, but that's another matter.
All right. Today, cyber stalking is the biggest weapon for experiential crimes as per IPC and CRPC law. And especially if it is done by a girl, there is no provision to even punish her because 354D is only for men. So what we do in that situation?
Madan? As a man.
Yeah, well, I frankly haven't even thought about this, but there are several gender neutral laws. I'm not sure whether this particular law is gender neutral or not. Okay, yeah, well then we'll have to read it as gender neutral at some point of time. Yeah.
Okay, last question, the young lady here in a lavender sari. Yeah, please go ahead.
So, and ma'am, you just said that, as young people, stand up for your rights, fight for your rights. But don't you think it's naive to expect from a government to refrain from using instruments like Pegasus, who have themselves come into power, mostly with the use of their friends at Meta or cases like Cambridge Analytica? I just feel it's just naive.
You want to comment?
Well, I think we should. Idealists are always accused of naivety, so I think I'll wear that with a certain amount of. Look, the truth is that you can say governments will always behave in this way, and that's a fair but a cynical view of governments. We can get governments to behave better because they have been forced to in other countries as well. When people stand up for their rights, when the media is conscious, when the judiciary rules, government will eventually have to conform. And by and large, these bureaucrats who write these rules and laws and implement them for the one or two political actors who want them done, these are all people who are like us, who are citizens, whose children are going to university with us, with you, I mean, who are very much part of the society. And my idealism comes from the fact that at bottom, this is not the kind of world they would like to leave behind to their children. So let's fight for it and let's give them the opportunity to see the error of their ways through, for example, judicial pronouncement, through public opinion, through strong media presence, and so on.
And let's not forget that we've just had, until 2 months ago, the longest civil resistance movement in the history of independent India, which is the farmers, and a very successful one. It forced the government, who refused to speak to them, who called them every name in the book, who threw everything at them, to repeal the laws. I'm not saying they won't come back, but here was a bunch of so-called Khalistanis who prevented the government from actually, not prevented, forced the government to repeal laws. So let's not forget the force of protest at all. On that note, thank you very much, Shashi, Madan, and Swati.
Thanks, Mohit.
So if I can, in a line, sum up for the audiences, the parliament is constrained, the judiciary is constrained, the media is constrained, the citizen is the only one who's not constrained. So that's the message that we carry. Thank you, Shashi, Madan, Swati, and Mohit. We also thank Value First for their support. Shashi and Swati will be signing the books.
Flexible, personal, and even funny at times. Just like your BFF, but more close and more personal. This is Value First.